Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I am having, unfortunately, something.
Oh, it's fritzing out again.
Is better?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I'll just stick without the headphones then. All right, super. Sorry about that. Thank you all for attending today's seminar. My name is Saba Siddiki. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a associate professor at Syracuse University. I'm just very happy to be here today with Christopher Frantz. We're going to be sharing a bit about the Institutional Grammar 2.0 with you. Specifically, we're going to be discussing the constitutive statements within the Institutional Grammar 2.0. And so if you'll pardon me, I'll just get into slideshow mode here. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Institutional Grammar 2.0, I'll spend just a moment providing a little bit of background on this as well. So the Institutional Grammar 2.0 is a revised specification of the institutional grammar that Chris and I have developed, which really was driven by two motivations. The first motivation of the Institutional Grammar 2.0 was to improve the ontological consistency of institutional grammar. And what we mean by this is to offer more clear differentiation between syntactic components that make up the institutional grammar to facilitate more reliable coding as well as more conceptual clarity generally. The other motivation for the Institutional Grammar 2.0 was essentially to enhance the computational tractability of the institutional grammar. And what we mean by that is make the coding of institutional statement information as well as the use of institutional statement information more computationally accessible. And as Chris and I started engaging in this work, what we realized was that in order to facilitate this computational tractability, we needed to have the ability to parse information in institutional statements along syntactic categories in more or less granular terms, and for the computational uses in particular, more granular terms. And therefore, one of the core features in the institutional grammar is these multiple levels of expressiveness along which institutional information can be parsed. So we have at the IG core level, a coding specification that is the most coarse of the three levels. And here we're assuming that we have humans both coding information as well as interpreting coding information. As we move to IG extended or coding institutional statement information at the IG extended level, there's more specificity, more parsing of syntactic information. And at the IG logical level, you have very specific parsing, very granular parsing of institutional information represented within statements and according with different syntactic components, which also then produces the most comprehensive kind of representations of institutional statement information. So basically with these three levels, we're providing guidance on coding institutional statement information with more or less granularity, ultimately to accommodate different types of uses and different analytical applications fundamentally. And I won't spend a lot of time going through the levels today, but wanted to highlight that this is a central feature of the Institutional Grammar 2.0. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the original grammar, I do want to highlight some additional refinements that have been presented with the IG 2.0. And some of these are relating to syntactic components and how we are characterizing and defining syntactic components. Some of these refinements relate to how we're organizing information that has been assigned to syntactic components. And then we also present a novel syntax for constitutive statements, which is the focus of today's lecture. But I will take a moment to just highlight some of these other refinements. So with respect to attributes and objects, we offer a slightly more identification within each of these. So for attributes, which are actors that carry out actions within statements, we now differentiate between actors and actor properties. Similarly, we differentiate objects with object properties, but the more obvious and one of the more significant syntactic refinements is actually a differentiation between direct objects and indirect objects that can each have properties associated with them. We've made some refinements to the condition syntactic component of the original institutional grammar. We now replace the condition with a context syntactic component, and we differentiate two types of context. One kind of context clause we refer to as activation conditions, which are basically conditions that instantiate situations or instantiate settings in which the actions of statements take place. And we distinguish those from execution constraints as another kind of context, and these are essentially accordant with your condition syntactic component in the original institutional grammar in the sense that these just qualify the action of the statement. We introduce a context taxonomy, which allows us to then further characterize types of context that can take either activation condition or execution constraint form. So for example, we differentiate between, offer a taxonomy that allows you to differentiate between spatial, temporal, and other types of context. And then another refinement that has a syntactic manifestation, but also relates to how institutional statement information is organized. We've introduced, building on some of Chris's work, this notion of nesting of institutional statements. From a syntactic perspective, the way this, the implication of this is we are now treating information that was previously placed in the object, the or else field, under the institutional grammar 1.0, if you will. We now identify this as its own kind of institutional statement that nests on a statement that contains A, B, D, I, C, or some combination of those components. Fundamentally, we've changed the conceptualization of the or else in the IG 2.0 in recognition that the information that we would tend to see in that field, in fact, tended to represent an entire institutional statement. And I'll give an example of this in just a moment. But so through this vertical nesting within the IG 2.0, we allowed for the characterization of a leading statement that identifies a particular activity, and then an or else consequential statement that nests on this, indicating a payoff associated with noncompliance with this leading statement. And then with this concept of horizontal nesting, we allow for the characterization of logical relationships between institutional statements and the actions that embed within them. So these are some of the key refinements. Another of the key refinements has to do with the treatment of constitutive statements more generally. And I'll spend the rest of this lecture along with Chris talking about this more specifically. But before I get into talking about constitutive statements, let me just give you the reference. What are we contrasting constitutive statements with? We are contrasting them with regulative statements. And here is an example of a regulative statement that has been coded, drawing on the various refinements that I just presented in the following, in the previous slide. So certified organic farmers must not apply synthetic chemicals to crops at any time once organic certification is conferred, or else certifier will revoke certification from farmer. So here we see that we've called out actors, we've called out actors' properties, we've indicated a difference between the direct object and indirect object as indicated on the previous slide. We've differentiated between execution kind of context and activation kind of context. And then we've represented what would have fallen in the institutional grammar 1.0 as information all belonging within the or else syntactic field as a separate institutional statement, because it has all the components of an institutional statement that nests on this other statement. So this is just a reference point. And when we look at policies, we see that, public policies are comprised of a variety of regulative statements that accord with this kind of form and accord with this kind of syntax. So if you look at the text here in red on this actual excerpt from the US National Organic Program regulation, you'll find statements that accord with this pattern. But what I'm highlighting in blue on this slide is a number of statements that are fundamentally doing something different within the document. So they're not regulating per se behavior, but they're actually defining important attributes within the context of this policy. They're defining important features within this type of policy, in this case, defining key terms that one would need to understand to make sense of the policy. And so we recognize these as kinds of constitutive statements in the sense that they're constituting features. And as Chris and I started to look at these statements and we look across other kinds of statements, we realized that the statements that we find play this defining role or this otherwise constituting role have in common that more generalizably are parameterizing features of the institutional domains that we are actually studying. And so this led us to thinking more specifically about what are the distinctive functions that constitutive statements are playing within institutional settings relative to regulative statements. And we summarize this distinction in the following way, that regulative statements are, just as they sound, are regulating actions, where constitutive statements are actually parameterizing institutional systems through various sorts of constitutive functions or constituting functions, ascription, definition, application, things of this nature. So, we've called out these functional differences between these different types of statements. But as we started working through examples of these, we realized that not only do these statements reflect a different kind of function, they also tend to exhibit a distinctive structural form that is not accommodated by the ABDICO syntax that was originally presented in the institutional grammar and which has been refined in the various ways that I've described in the institutional grammar 2.0. And the implications of this have been quite serious. So sometimes it's meant that, coders have completely discarded these kinds of statements from their coding. So for example, in this would be just simply discarding the blue statements, but we know that this is actually really important kind of information. The other implication is that coders have changed the structure or implied institutional information within the context of institutional statements to make it amenable to the application of this ABDICO syntax, which can lead to significant concerns about reliability in coding, but even importantly, loss of meaning. And therefore, in the institutional grammar 2.0, we deal with this in a couple of ways. One, we offer an alternative definition of institutional statements in which we call out the possibility of having institutional statements that play a different functional role within institutional systems. So we've modified this definition of an institutional statement now to be a statement that describes actions for actors within the presence or absence of particular constraints, or parameterizes features of an institutional system, where the latter pertains to constitutive statements. But importantly, we've also introduced a novel set of syntactic components that would be applicable when you are coding constitutive statements. And as we engaged in this exercise for thinking about what these syntactic components would be, we turned to existing literature that gives us a sense of syntactic forms of constitutive statements. So many of you will be very familiar with this base syntax of constitutive statements presented by Syrla. X is Y in context Z. So we started to code constitutive statements according to this syntax, but we were left with a number of questions on the table. And I've listed those here. What is X? exactly what is Y? Is there some, are there common properties of the kinds of, among the values that tend to accord with X and Y when applying this base syntax to code constitutive statements? We found that the information, the values tended to be right, heterogeneous in kind. It's not always like an actor, right, that would associate with an attribute. So we wanted to have some more thought on what exactly X and Y are. Are there generalizable properties that will help us to just identify this? We were curious to know, does is take different values, and what kinds of values does is take in the context of different statements? The context Z is Z. We were curious to know if this Z in constitutive statements is analogous to context in regulative statements. And the final question that we left with, our initial coding exercise around this was, are there other components that are commonly reflected in constitutive statements, but that are not reflected in this base syntax? What we found from our exercise in thinking about this X is Y and Z and the questions we've posed in relation to that is that there are certain generalizable properties or generalizable features of the values that correspond to these different syntactic components, which we accommodate with a reformulated set of syntactic components and that we augment in ways that I'll describe in the following slides. So we've replaced X with a syntactic component constituting properties. And this syntactic component essentially delineates properties that assign to Y, which we characterize as the constituted entity within the statement. We replace is with the syntactic component constitutive function, which is the verb that describes the functional relationship between the constituting property and the constituted entity. And we do in fact map Z to context as conceived of in the Institutional Grammar 2.0, which can take the form of either activation conditions or execution constraints and can be further taxonomized according to our context taxonomy. So listed at the bottom of this slide is an example of this. In student recruitment plans, diversity means diversity in race, religion, sexual orientation, and gender. What we see here being constituted is actually this term or this concept of diversity, which through the constituting function of means is assigned these properties of diversity in race, religion, sexual orientation, and gender. And in this initial clause in student recruitment plans gives us the context in which this constitution is relevant. Now, turning to our next question, are there missing components in that base syntax, X is Y is under Z? We find in our review of constitutive statements that indeed there are missing syntactic components, and those are ones that we would find in the case of regulative statements. So we find that it's possible that constitutive statements also include deontics. So if we turn back to this example, in student recruitment plans, diversity must mean diversity in these ways. And we also find that it's possible to find or else values within constitutive statements. And we give an example here, or else plan is void, right? So this is the consequence represented as an entire independent institutional statement that nests on this preceding statement. Now, we do observe within the constitutive statements something unique about or else's, which is that whereas in the context of regulative statements, we find that the or else value tends to be mostly consequential in nature and an assignation of some kind of payoff according with non-compliance with a particular activity. In the context of constitutive statement, that or else can be consequential or existential in kind. The way to think about this, if what a constitutive statement is doing is constituting some feature of a system, a violation of that is actually, right, meaning that such and such thing that was being constituted is not being constituted. Therefore, it's the difference between something existing or not existing. So it is useful to think about how or else's are a bit different in the context of these statements. Just as with regulative statements where we identify necessary and sufficient components, for those of you who are familiar with IG 1.0, right, where AIC, aim, attributes, aims, and conditions are the necessary components, we would find in constitutive statements that the constituted entity, constitutive function, and context are the necessary components while the others remain sufficient. Now, at this stage, I'll turn it over to Chris, which will talk about constitutive statements and their variants in more detail.
Thank you very much, Saba. Just a second, I'll attempt sharing. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, I hope so. So sorry for the inconvenience of doing this sharing, but that's the very nature of those shared activities. And the idea is there that, of course, the constitutive statements and the baseline syntax that Saba just described in detail applies across different levels, again, of complexity or different levels of expressiveness, as we call them. And just to motivate this a bit, I'm not going in depth in this because the essence of this talk is really about to highlight the challenges, but also opportunities that come with the coding of constitutive statements more specifically. But in the IG core level, we have a very simply coarse-grained characterization, as called out by Saba. Extended again looks into more details of the coded statements. For example, we would decompose elements such as this enumeration here, that diversity in race, religion, and sexual orientation and gender and so on is actually a logical combination of different constituents in the widest sense of diversity. But one attention I want to, or one feature I want to draw attention to right now is the idea of having constitutive function types, which I want to highlight, which is kind of exists on the highest level of expressiveness and seek to characterize the semantics that are associated with individual components or statements more generally. But in this instance, it's really just highlighting the characterization of the constitutive function itself, because this is a major departure from this classical X is Y in context Z syntax, but rather the idea here is that those constitutive functions can be a characteristic of or can describe the policy documents themselves. So, for example, to signal the date at which, for example, a policy document comes into force, or signals the purpose and so on, or be specific to entities. And then offer for example, the notion of definition, defining individual entities, their relationship therein. So I'll provide you with some examples to motivate this a bit. And of course, to signal the establishment merely of entities as they are relevant in an institutional setting, let alone the conferral of status, which is one of the central functions that constitutive statements entertain in the context, especially of policy. So just to motivate the idea of constitutive statements and how they're coded syntactically, Saba gave us already a glimpse. Just motivated a bit more with two different types that kind of highlight those different features and linkages via the constitutive functions. We may have, for example, a commissioner of agriculture and market that shall be the chairperson of the council. So the constituted entity is clearly the chairperson of the council that is then populated and related to the commissioner of agriculture and markets. Conversely, we could have a composition relationship, if you like, that links the council and its members, right? So the council consists of elected officials that carry further properties alongside. So we see this distinctive differentiation of the constitutive function across different statements. And there are other taxonomies of a different nature, but they generally offer a characterization on rule level, right, on statement level. This is specific to the function. Just for the sake of contrast, I offer the a coding of course, a regulative institutional statement at the bottom here, one we already kind of tentatively saw earlier on anyway. Right, but one of the key points, or one of the challenges that we actually need to address really is not so much just to provide yet another syntax that we attach to the institutional grammar, but we need to address at the same time philosophical challenges and also empirical challenges. And they have been expressed by a number of theorists, including Giddens, suggesting that regulative statements can, of course, have constitutive role in their own kind. So why then have constitutive statements on top of it? Another challenge to it is the view that the distinction in some instances of or between constitutive statements and regulative statements is merely linguistic in kind. So it's merely a different form of saying the same, if you like. And perhaps a more prominent critique of the original conception by Searle is the idea that the antecedent constitution of behavior before it's then actually enacted and regulated may not hold and simply hold in all cases. So how do we deal with this? Well, empirical observations suggests, and Saba has motivated this quite well, that in policy, we actually have those sections that are dedicated to definitions or conceptual characterizations in the first place. So how do we capture those? And we want to address those by providing coders with distinctive and clear operational heuristics. Of course, those build on the characterization that Saba offered earlier, in which we characterize regulative statements as signals of expected behavior in the widest sense. So they are behavior-centric in kind, whereas constitutive statements have this parameterizing or reparameterizing or modifying function in the widest sense that are linked to the institutional system in a wider sense. So they're system-centric when we talk about the institutional perspective. And to operationalize this more explicitly, we have a set of heuristics that will offer that, of course, directly reflect the function that may be associated with a particular statement, either behavior regulation or system parameterization is just highlighted, or can be of further kind, more complex kind, looking into consequences of violation or consequences of hypothetical violation of set statements, and then identify if, for example, the consequences are more localized and affect the actor that has responsibly acted or violated a particular statement, or are more systemic in kind, and again have this reparameterizing character. Anyway, so but the focus here should be not to call out the simple cases, but rather look at some of the challenging cases that have been motivated, and not those very cases, but the underlying principles of which have been motivated in other discussions. And here's one of those statements we can just dissect a bit. And if we look at the statement carefully, it of course reads quite regulative in kind. It suggests that the producer must establish and maintain preventative livestock healthcare practices, which are defined in the following, including, right? So, and if we look at the statement, we can indeed see, of course, a primary kind of statement that is regulative, right? So it regulates or signals expected behavior, or rather expected behaviors, that is establishing and maintaining. So an example of this horizontal nesting, preventative livestock healthcare practices, and which is then followed, in fact, which are then defined rather in line by a set of an enumeration of different characteristics that have some constitutive character, right? Because they're defining the healthcare practices. So not only do we see always those clear-cut characterizations in terms of regulative statements or constitutive statements only, but those mixed forms can occur as well, and they are more common than one would expect simply from looking at the theoretical discussion of constitutive statements in the first place. So when we consider those kind of statements as hybrid institutional statements as a concept that can combine those two perspectives, and is always informed by the feature or the particular statement type that has either entertains a parameterizing role or has the capacity for guiding behavior or signaling expected behavior. So in this instance, for example, we would have a regulative constitutive hybrid, if you like, whereas the leading statement indeed signals the primary function of this entire statement, that is to regulate behavior, but embedded therein is an instantiation of a novel concept that hasn't been called out elsewhere or defined elsewhere. So, and what we offer here, and that's really the point about the integrated syntax, not yet another syntax as part of the institutional grammar, but that we can actually afford an integrated representation where we capture the regulative part, simplified here. I mean, I don't want to go into details of the syntactic characterization, but I don't want to motivate this integrated nature. So where we have a regulative characterization of behavior that's expected, and the definition then of those healthcare practices that are an object, for example, in a regulative statement, in terms of an institutional statement that nests on this object, but has this constitutive features in its own right? So that's the idea that's basically expressed in here. So we have those hybrid characterizations that we can nevertheless integrate. And what's the benefit of this? Well, the benefit of this is that we can still identify across those statements those distinctive entities as they are introduced into policy or identified and related between regulative statements and constitutive statements that bring them about in the first place. But it also offers another opportunity, which is we can systematically now separate and treat them based on uniform transformation rules or otherwise. And here, for example, separate those this integrated sentence into two statements if we wanted to, where one of them is of regulative kind and calls out the expected behavior, if you like, and the second statement then being of constitutive kind, which exclusively focuses on the definition of that very entity, the constituted entity that we are concerned with. So those are the kind of opportunities that arise from there. And of course, we can just focus on regulative statements only if we were not interested in healthcare practices, or conversely in the other type of statements where necessary. And this can, of course, be the same for the converse case where we have a constitutive statement. Then it's exactly the statement that Saba called out earlier, a slightly more detailed coding here, but that the consequence can then be regulative in kind. So for example, if diversity as defined by a university is not implemented on departmental level, then there can be a consequence that can be regulative in kind, such as retracting a plan, sending individuals to training and the like. So this is not just signaling that one type of behavior can precede the other, but actually that they can be related in various forms. So having the conception of the hybrid cases, I'm sure the experienced coders amongst you will already think about possibly one step further and think about statements that actually are perhaps a bit more contentious, if you like. And here I draw on a case which we in fact have recently discussed as part of our ongoing evaluation effort. And which has led to interesting discussions, but it's a good example of the challenges that you face in the unambiguous characterization, which we really want to call out in this very talk and make subject of to discussion. And here the statement suggests that paragraphs 1 to 8, meaning other statements in the same policy, shall not apply to water supply installations in accordance with some paragraph and further characterization thereof. So on the one hand, we could code this, and this is kind of a concession to the syntactic form as it's laid out in constitutive terms, suggesting that paragraphs 1 to 8 are not really established but modified, affected. So the constituted entity can also signal a modification, not just the constitution of an entity. Shall not apply to water supply installation, and therefore be conceived as configurational in kind, because it changes a set of other institutional statements in the wider sense, thereby the institutional setting more generally. And in contrast, we can, of course, draw an inference and look into paragraphs 1 to 8 and identify a responsible actor, and then signal that this actor is now responsible for ensuring that paragraphs 1 to 8 are no longer applied, let's say, in the context of water supply installations. And that's a very prevailing practice that Saba had called out earlier when she suggested how one deals with constitutive statements at the current stage. But again, it's a reformulation of the statement. And as part of the discussion, we arrived at an interesting understanding that we can perform this analysis or this coding in the widest sense, in a narrow sense, with focus on the individual statements, or in a wider sense that takes the richer context into account. And both of those positions have their merits, and that's why I want to elaborate briefly on them, but also, of course, their consequences. So if you focus on the individual statement as part of the coding exercise, we narrow the focus of concern, but also reduce the unit of analysis back to the signal statement that we are actually interested in, we can then analyze the consequence of a possible violation. So if we assume that we only analyze the individual statement here, as it's called on the beginning, paragraphs 1 to 8, there's no explicit characterization of consequence here in the first place. So we could just, for example, hypothesize the absence of the statement as a consequence of not enacting it, if you like, which would mean it would reconfigure the institutional setting in a wider sense by affecting paragraphs 1 to 8 implicitly. So the other perspective, again, is the one that I mentioned, that we can actually resolve those relational semantics. In practice, it means we look into the reference statements and well, in worst case, even the statements that are referenced therein, if you like, and reconstruct this institutional setting and complement the statement by transforming it in terms of the structure that's expressed in those reference statements. So in practice, that would mean we infer the actor that is responsibly acting here. So again, the consequences are should be clear. We have a fixed unit of analysis, which makes I believe the coding simpler in the first place, likely more reliable, of course, to be tested, but it leaves the deferral of any sort of semantic resolution of those relationships between statements to the analytical states. So conversely, then, if we have this variable unit of analysis, we actually dig deeper and perform some sort of regress across different statements. We are much more sensitive to reliability issues with respect to the contextual knowledge, experience of coders, and domain embeddedness, and so on. So those are concerns to be held or taken into account. And it, of course, affords some systemic interpretation immediately. And that may be well desirable. It's just important to call out those two different positions that one can hold on different statements, as we have identified in practice. And what's the consequence? Well, if we were to allow, or if we want to ensure that we have a uniform and consistent, for mostly, that's the important bit, a consistent characterization of institutional statements across those different types, well, then we need to find a kind of a reconciliation for this, if you like, right? So analytical perspectives can diverge, but the coding should respond to those, of course. But calling out examples for analytical perspectives, one might be more interested in actually looking at the structural properties of the text more immediately. That is, statements as they are expressed, related, meaning the policy as subject to study, so having a structural focus. And in contrast, the analytical perspective could be, as it is in many publications related to the original institutional grammar, focus, for example, on network analysis or reconstruction of the institutional setting in simulations, if you like. And in those instances, there's, of course, a desire to reconstruct the institutional setting from within, if you like, from within the action situation, but certainly from the perspective of the responsible actors that are embedded in the situation. And of course, calls then also, based on the analytical necessities, for a sort of uniform structural representation, let's say in regulative form, so akin to the one I called out earlier. And how do we reconcile this? Well, we have now this distinctive treatment that may be driven by analytical objectives, but nevertheless want to afford also a uniform representation that would be agnostic in the widest sense and leave, for example, allow us to establish data sets that are agnostic with respect to the specific uses. Well, the idea is here that we can have such polymorphic institutional statements, meaning statements then take different forms, literally. And again, recalling the ones we have characterized earlier, we can now code this statement in a combined form, right, where we both retain the reference to the actor if we want to, of course, call out the deontics, which happen to be the shared component type, but the divergent constitutive function or aim, respectively, and then clearly signal the relationship again between the regulative statements, which calls out the paragraphs 1 to 8 as an object, if you like, that is to be addressed, or of course the constitutive and thereby modified entity in the constitutive kind of interpretation, if you like. So those are the extremal forms that we recognize here. So the idea is here we have put great effort into identifying not only prototypical characterizations of statements of constitutive and regulative kinds, but also recognize those blends and distinctive classes as they exist and as we observe them in practice. Very much the motivation for having such a integrated syntax in the first place. Again, we explicitly introduce a distinction between the coded side and the analytical side there, but the distinction is clear and based on heuristics. So there are some guidelines as to how to entertain it. But when we look at this, it also resolves theoretical challenges or those philosophical challenges to the concept of constitutive statements in the first place, as expressed for a long time over a period of several decades, by really integrating and recognizing this potential integration of those two types of statements, and not so much seeing it as a bifurcation, as opposed to identifying the leading or guiding characterization of the statement, either as being parameterizing in nature, but possibly entertaining some sort of regulative function on top of it, or being regulating, so regulating behavior primarily, but also maying in this process, as exemplified earlier, constitute new entities that are then used in continuation of the policy. So this also makes this concept more robust against particular characterization as they occur in different forms of regulation, meaning if regulation tends to specify constituted entity inline, we can capture this easily, even if they're no longer clearly separated, as we would, for example, assume in standard policy texts that may have been more commonplace. And of course, kind of addressing this intersection here, again, we have those polymorphic institutional statements that can take either shape depending on needs. So to bring this all to a close, because I've expanded and detailed quite a bit, I went big into weeds, but I wanted to take you into the weeds to appreciate and understand a bit of the challenges that we actually have when coding those statements, and hopefully convince you of the merits, to have this distinction, but also perhaps can, shed a light on the opportunities that you may have for your own research when thinking about this kind of distinction. So the IG2 now integrates basically all those characterizations, both having an integrated syntax, recognizing pure forms, mixed forms of different types, reconciles this empirical perspective with the theoretical perspective, and of course distinguishes between coding and analytical purposes, something that was somewhat more blurred in traditional coding practice, but we can call this out more explicitly. So all those the concepts on the discussion that have been entertained here, of course, subject to ongoing empirical assessment. We have a coding validation group that engages in repeated coding of statements and continuous coding of statements, and selected projects that start to draw on it. And of course, we provide guidelines and heuristics, as just motivated briefly, in the form of a code book. This current code book that's already out there does not contain the heuristics to this date, but this is something we intend to do for the next release, which is due in the upcoming weeks in the first place. But with this, I want to conclude really, and open the discussion hopefully, so we get some feedback from you, and thank you for your attention in the first place. So are there any reactions or any questions that we can offer clarification on?
Everybody's digesting the information.
Too much, yeah. I accept that. It's quite dense in terms of the concepts. But I mean, it would be conceivably easy to construe a constitutive syntax on its own, but the value is really the integration. But I see someone is unmuting, please.
I'll ask a question if someone else wants to jump in. This is fascinating stuff, but it does take a little digesting. But I'm kind of uncertain as to what this means sort of at the end. Do you end up having a clear distinction between regulative and constitutive statements, or have you somehow mushed them together into being slightly different versions of this more general class of hybridized sort of statements? Is there a clear distinction between one level or one type of statement or not? And I can see you going in either direction on that, and I'm just kind of curious how you would react to that.
Yeah. I mean, if I take it quite literally, you're asking for the distinction. And I think the essential point that we're offering here is that we actually retain this distinction, at least in as far as the definition is concerned. So having one type of statement that is focused primarily on the parameterization, the configuration of the system, the other one on behavior regulation. But we recognize that this purity in practice, does not always exist, or in fact rarer than we want it to be in many instances. But then what this integration offers is, first of all, to call this out, to identify, hang on, the statement is not only regulative at kind, something that has been called on in theoretical debates already, but also to be able then to, for example, transform or perhaps separate and re-establish this kind of distinctive characterization you're calling for by suggesting, let's take out this regulative characterization and this constitutive component, then we can analyze them in isolation. So it's not the idea or intent to mush them together as you suggest, but I see to accommodate or to react to what we see in practice and then find ways of dealing with this analytically. Right? So, I mean, again, it's the approach is in principle agnostic to particular analytical objectives. So it's merely about calling out the existence or presence of constituted entities in the first place, or identification. Or if we're merely interested in, regulation of behavior, which may be perfectly fine, then it at least allows us to identify those cases and, systematically discard the rest if we wanted to, right? So, or systematically treat both of those. Does this respond in some way or another to your question, or does it confuse it rather further?
Somewhat. I mean, I wasn't quite clear what I was asking, frankly. So the answer was kind of good. But I guess another part of what I'm a little bit uncertain about here is it sounds like part of the inspiration for this was being able to understand how different kinds of statements are nested in each other, and building institutional statements into a better representation of all the pieces involved, say, in some policy instrument or some policy program of some kind, and trying to find some way to show how these are linked together and defined in some kinds of ways. And the way you've set it up, it has a real natural structure of being able to nest one within the other and then nest another one within the other. And I'm reminded of my undergraduate days as a math major, and once you start anything, it's extremely complicated, which may be exactly what we need to understand institutional. And so what I'm saying about whether there's a separation or not is related to this notion of nesting, and whether your end goal is to really integrate these together in a little more systematic manner than you're able to do at this time. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, one of the challenges we find is really that the institutional grammar is an abstraction from linguistics, right? And that's something we need to recognize in the first place. And I think what you're calling out for is, are you then able to distinguish components that are identified, constituted in the system, and reconstruct the system in its, idiomatic form, so to say, where we set up the individual components and then selectively or in consequence then applying the regulative statements that link those based on the duties expressed therein. And that's precisely the idea, because we recognize that, we as human, right, we don't write in terms of institutional statements, at least not yet. But in any case, so it makes this distinction important and makes it quite challenging to otherwise extract it. But so, Saba, perhaps you have something to add. I don't know. I just took this question. Sorry for that.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I guess I would just build on everything Christopher said. I mean, Mike, I was so curious to have your reactions on this as we were presenting. Our sense was, these constitutive statements just play such an important role in action situations. They're parameterizing the system. They are, setting up the action situations. And as we were developing this and working with this, we just realized, the lack of structural accommodation, like syntactic accommodation of this, was actually meaning that we were discarding these, or, not giving constitutive statements the attention that they really afford, given the important functional role that they play within action situations. So, the key thing here is, in terms of like, where do we fall in this debate? Are there differences between regulative and constitutive? We've kind of hard on the, yes, there is. There's a functional difference, and that functional difference tends to accord with the structural difference. But insofar as how are we thinking about this as integrated with regulative syntax or regulative statements? In my mind, in a few ways, just building on Chris. One, we find that there are similar syntactic components like the deontics, the context, the or else's. So we actually are suggesting that now the institutional grammar, these aren't two separate syntax. We have one integrated syntax that can accommodate two combinations of syntactic components that reflect structural forms of statements that have different functional properties. And then the other way we thought about the integration is, sometimes we want to understand configurations of statements and action situations, like, right, you're setting up the positions with the constitutive statements, and then the regulative choice rules are indicating the actions of those actors that occupy those positions. And so like that is another integration point in the sense that we can actually then think about studying statements as fundamentally linked to, configured together to structure what happens within action situations. But then the more like involved integration is that in these polymorphic sense, in the sense that sometimes you actually do have ones that can be represented in integrated ways. But I guess the underlying motivation here is that like we want to be able to recognize the critical role that constitutive statements play. And then it seems, given that the grammar takes a structural orientation to understanding statements, then we need a unique structural form to accommodate that functional difference, if that makes sense.
Well, I will say one last thing on this. What you're doing, the way you described constitutive statements as parameterizing institution or the system, institutional systems. I really like that. I'm not quite sure what it means right now, but I like it because it makes a natural connection between something happening in the operational or regulatory sort of regulative sort of level is being structured at a higher level by decisions made in other sorts of structures. But again, it's this nesting. It's a similar kind of structure, a similar kind of syntactic or semantic kind of structure, or whatever, logical structure, whatever you want to call it. So I think you're really on this, quite promising and moving in this direction. And so I guess the gist of my comment is just keep developing this and keep working on this. This is really fascinating stuff, but I don't quite understand it yet.
Well, and Mike, sorry, Chris, may I say one more quick thing? So it's just raised so many interesting questions for us, because now we're trying to develop heuristics about like how do you distinguish between regulative and constitutive. So now we're like confronted with these very to what seem to us to be very interesting questions, is what does violatability of a regulative statement versus a constitutive statement mean? And how repeated does that violation have to be in order to fundamentally change the structure of the action situation? And we think about, in the context of, like a regulative statement that says that we expect a sort of a repeated action, right? It's where that regulated, that directive is, you assume, will be interpreted multiple times and acted on multiple times, and you can violate it multiple times without fundamentally changing the system. But with a constitutive statement that's like constituting a key feature of a system, a one time, and assuming that that's you apply that in a limited number of times, a one-time violation of that fundamentally now changes the structure of the action situation in the first place. So it's like, it's leading to all of these other questions about, the role of constitutive statements in action situations and what acting on those statements in different ways actually does to the institutional system.
Okay.
Go ahead, Chris.
if I may just offer the response, you mentioned you were still questioning the idea of parameterization. I think a sensible distinction that maybe intuitively accessible to some extent is really that the constitutive statements really take this ontological role of setting up, right? So of defining entities and so on, and the regulative statements in contrast really specify precisely what they're meant to do, duty in the wide sense, deontics, right? So and if this distinction is reasonably clear, or makes the situation reasonably clear, because we no longer care what is actually constituted as long as we are able to identify that it is, actors, actions, objects, entities, or whatever else, and then linked in this following form. And then, of course, the question is the interaction patterns that may change and modify those statements along akin to what Saba just elaborated on exactly.
No, I will respond to one part of Saba's sort of suggestion. I had a little time to think about that. The number of repetition of violations or recurrences of a given sort of situation, and then different institutional arrangements that are occurring. I think that's an important distinction, is that you can have lots of operational level or regulative sort of level violations that's sort of built into the system. But at the constitutive level, you could have something tear it apart and make a fundamental disruption throughout the system, because it is systemic more than simply behavioral sorts of approaches. And so that's a powerful kind of distinction. But what Christopher's getting here in his comment, I think, is that it is another way in which this is quite promising, in that you're providing structure to the components in the grammar in the first place, the institutional grammar in the first place. And you're saying that those structures come from these higher level constitutive structures that are defining what counts as an actor, or defining what counts as an aim, or defining these things. And you're doing it in a way that's, what you're doing at that higher level is fundamentally related to what you're doing at the lower level. And so you can move up and down, which is critical, because in real systems, you're going to have so many levels. You need to have some way to be able to move up and down without bringing in a totally different form of analysis. So you're doing a nice job of sort of integrating and sort of over temporal sorts of. It's fascinating, and I hope to see more about what you're doing in the future. So very interesting. Surely someone else has a question.
Yeah, Robert has a question, actually.
Yeah, I can. So I think in general, like I find this sort of distinction between sort of parameterization and like sort of modification to be a really useful one. One thing I wanted to follow up on, Chris, from your presentation was you talked about the sort of case where the sort of original constitutive statement that somebody lays out is like modified, right? Where you constitute something and then something about that constitutive statement is changed later on. And this seems to me to be a really hard case, right? Like it's not, because I mean, to me, the sort of substantive utility of having constitutive statements laid out is to be able to ask questions like, when would a politician choose to write something new to constitute a new entity or a new policy, as opposed to modifying something that already exists? And what are the consequences of doing that, right? Are those sort of complementary, or are they substituting like things? But when you're talking about sort of modifying a constitutive statement, it seems like the distinction breaks down a little bit, and it's not obvious to me how to handle that. So I'd be curious to hear you sort of talk more about that case. That's when you sort of brought up briefly in the middle of the presentation.
Yeah, so that's precisely. I mean, your point is precisely right. I mean, we're really looking at the consequences of violation, right, of a distinctive statement. So if in the extreme case, let's say the case where a consequence is not specified, it basically means the statement doesn't come about, or whatever entity is specified in the statement simply doesn't come about without further consequences, which we deem a reparameterization of the system, especially if that entity is referenced elsewhere, right? So if a regulative statement calls on the committee that has never been established to, perform a certain action or signal an expected behavior. The example you you are highlighting, and this was in fact this contentious example that I brought up, I assume. This is actually a reference to coding practice. So it's not so much a seeking or suggesting what is right or wrong, but rather an observation of specifically of discussions we had with very experienced coders and especially analysts of different background, right? So because it came clearly out what analytical objectives people actually had in terms of either looking at the statements in their idiomatic form, like, perhaps they may have been well constitutive in kind, but actually operationalizing this in regulative form because, it meets the analytical needs there. So this can be a gross reformulation. The consequences can be, of course, sensible. Coming back to the specific statement, what happens is roughly, well, logically what happens is as follows. If you take this paragraph 1 to 8 example, and you're suggesting a violation of this example on constitutive grounds, it would mean the statement would not take effect. Therefore, the constraints imposed by this very statement across those paragraphs would not take effect, right? Simple as that. Whereas if you infer the actor, for example, by taking it from those reference statements in the first place and drawing it into this top-level statements, you're suddenly also drawing in the semantics, violation semantics, as expressed in those various reference statements. So fundamentally, you're changing the structure not only by inferring the actor, but also by deferring the consequences or the management of the consequences, which then will be localized onto those individual statements. Right. So there is this implication as well that the primary statement borrows and resolves the semantic relationships basically as expressed in the reference statement, right? The final statement that we are dealing with. I hope this responds to your concern a bit, if that makes any sort of sense.
It does, yeah. It strikes me as a very difficult case to sort of measure and lay out well. So just hearing your sort of thought process is useful here. Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay. Any more questions?
I have, this is David Yu at Purdue. I have a question. So I'm relatively new to this IGRI, institutional grammar stuff, so I may sound dumb here, but I'm more interested in coding like this planning type documents, not really like this policy, like strict rule, like regulatory documents, but rather like policy, land use planning, disaster planning, evacuation planning, this type of planning documents. And these documents tend to be really messy. And the type of institutional statements that are contained in this type of documents tend to be more strategy, like there's strategy, norm, and institution, but like rule, but most of statements in such types of documents tend to be more like a strategy, and I'm not sure whether there are really constitutive statements. The many parts of this document describe like situation, like there's this river, watershed, this roads, this infrastructure, people should do this, when this happens, like a lot of this type of procedural strategy type statements. So I wonder how this IGRI 2.0 would be. I mean, your high-level device and how this, this thing can be applied to this type of planning documents, whether this constitutive grammar rule can be applied to parameterizing this, like a natural or physical environment also. Yeah.
I mean, Chris, I can start if you don't mind. Yeah. So, David, my sense is that there are a few governing documents, policy, planning, or otherwise, in which you won't find some constitutive statements of some sort, in the sense that they could even be simply defining the goals, like defining the goals of a plan. Oftentimes these can be represented in constitutive terms. And so clearly this is likely to be something you'd find in planning documents. Defining entities in charge of things, assigning venues, identifying venues in which planning processes might occur. I suspect you'll find some, but the number that you'll find certainly, I think, depends on the type of document you're dealing with.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Perhaps to expand or offer a response. I mean, sometimes constitutive statements are not as obvious as they may appear. So Saba earlier highlighted when she called out the syntax that they are necessary and sufficient components, right? Just defining a field is, in a way constitutive with respect to the institutional representation, right? Because it draws a physical entity into this institutional realm. And here, the mere calling out, the field exists in a way, or there is a field in a wider sense, is still compliant with the syntactic components that we have, because we merely require the identification of an entity and a constitutive function associated with this, and the context characterization, which in absence always means at all times. So I think that's my impression, that you can still code the barely existing constituted entities in the widest sense, but also perhaps it may not be as obvious that entities embedded or implicitly characterized as part of other more regulative statements may actually be constitutive in kind.
Okay. Yeah, I think I really need to dig into and really study this grammar rule that you're developing to ask more intelligent questions and yeah, and to really think about it. Yeah, but thank you for your advice. Yeah.
No, I think it's a great question, David. I don't think it's a yeah.
We are out of time. Any more questions before we wrap it up for today?
I'll just say, thank you so much for listening. I know we presented a lot of information in this short amount of time. We really are, looking forward to having more advice and feedback from you all. So if you'd like to have a more thorough explanation of the Institutional Grammar 2.0 and constitutive statements within that, on the IGRI website under resources, we've posted the IG 2.0 codebook that provides a very detailed explanation of this. So
let me add the qualification. Please wait 1 or perhaps 2 weeks until we have the updated version there. Then you'll find all the features we have discussed here represented. Otherwise, you'll get the bare syntax, but no heuristics. And so that's the nice part. You really that's the latest work literally on this, and we still need to reflect. And it's quite a document to do that in. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for your attention. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher and Saba, for this very interesting presentation. And thanks to everybody for their interest.
Thank you indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you again next month.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.